We've got two great speakers today, and the morning session is also going to be live streamed through our YouTube channel for Joint Power staff across the state. The afternoon session will not be live streamed, but this session will be. So we'll provide some time for questions via the YouTube where they can type in questions. And the speakers will give you their instructions on when and how you can ask your questions during their presentations. So for our first speaker today, we have Shari Roeseler. She's the Executive Director and CEO for the Society of the Blind. And the Society of Blind, she's going to go into much more detail, but essentially it provides education services to people who are low vision and blind in a 26-county region, so a large scope there. Prior to joining the Society of the Blind, she served as the Executive Director for St. Anthony Foundation, one of the largest nonprofit service agencies in San Francisco. So Shari, come on up and let us be informed about Society of Blind and how we can best serve victims who are vision impaired.
Morning, everyone. You're all sitting way in the back. Like we don't bite. Carrie and I are really nice. So I'm going to move the mic here a little bit. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about Society for the Blind and the services that we provide. This is our 60th anniversary year, so we're excited and doing different things to celebrate that. As Mika mentioned, we are the only comprehensive center in 26 counties providing blindness education, low vision eye care, including vision rehabilitation services, and then support groups and other supportive services for individuals who are blind and low vision. So we do cover a pretty broad swath. We span from Solano County up to the Oregon border, and then eastward towards Modesto, Stanislaus County, and then west almost all the way to the coast. So pretty broad area that we cover. So today, what I want to talk to you about are sort of three main topic areas, and one of those will be factors that are unique. And I'm going to start in a little bit just kind of talking about leading causes of blindness and some of the implications for that. We're going to talk about best practices. So if you are working with a victim of crime who is blind or low vision, some ways that might facilitate working with them. And then also resources that are available, various assistive devices and the like. And I brought a few, so we'll have a little bit of show and tell as we go through the program. I think what I'll offer to do is take questions as we go along through the presentation. I'll just try to be mindful of my time allotment to not go over. So I don't know if we take questions from folks watching, if they email or. Okay. All right, thank you. So let's begin by talking a little bit about how low vision impacts our community in the United States. Conservative estimates will say that there are about 10% of the population suffers from vision loss or blindness. And we say it's conservative because it's really based on self-reporting. And what we know, particularly for folks with low vision, they tend to not report because there's a lot of fear around admitting that I can't see very well, admitting that maybe because of my vision loss, I should no longer be driving and whatnot. So we know that low vision in particular is underreported. But if we look at the Sacramento region, we would say there's probably around 110 to 120,000 individuals living with low vision and blindness. In the United States, it comes to roughly 21 to 22 million people. So it's a good chunk of folks. We have, I think, about 34 million people in the state of California, so 10% of that, well over close to 3.5 million people. Now, low vision and blindness is something that we call a low incidence, high impact health condition, in that there may not seem like there are a lot of people with it, but when you're affected by low vision or blindness, it has a significant impact on your life. Now, vision loss is considered any loss of vision or visual acuity that cannot be corrected even with eyeglasses or contact lenses. So these are folks that some part of their vision may be occluded, they may have a scotoma or a blind spot, but yet they can see other things. And And then blindness, legal blindness in the United States is defined as acuity that is 20/200 or worse, or where their visual field is 20 degrees or less. So a pretty restricted field. In the United States today, blindness is ranked as the #3 most feared health crisis behind cancer and heart disease. So it gives you a sense of just how much we fear losing our vision. The next couple of slides are going to show you images and how they will appear for folks who are affected by different kinds of vision loss. And I hope that what some of this will do for you is perhaps you have a family member, a parent, a grandparent who has one of these conditions. It can help us sort of have a little bit more understanding and compassion for how the world looks for them. But also when you're working with a victim of crime, if they have one of these conditions, perhaps how you present materials, where they're seated in a room, the kind of lighting, all of that is impacted by their vision. The 4 leading causes of blindness in the United States are cataracts, glaucoma, age-related macular degeneration, and diabetic retinopathy. In these slides, you're going to see how someone with these various conditions might see an image. And also, even though somebody could read an eye chart, so they might be able to see the large E and maybe even a couple letters down, that doesn't necessarily give an accurate read on their actual vision and on their vision loss. So if somebody has a loss of depth perception, they might do a pretty good job on the eye chart, but the minute they try to walk down and there are gray chairs on gray carpeting, they're tripping. So it's that kind of thing that helps us start to understand the different ways vision is impacted. In this image, we have 2 girls playing on stairs. And what you see is you'll see a hazy or darkish area there in the background. This is what somebody with central field loss experiences when they look at an object. And people with age-related macular degeneration, this is a typical kind of way that they end up seeing as this disease progresses. Age-related macular degeneration is the leading cause of blindness for people age 60 and over in the United States. And it affects predominantly Caucasians, and those who smoke are 2 times more likely to get and develop age-related macular degeneration. So if you want a good reason to quit smoking or tell somebody else to quit smoking, this would be a good reason. Age-related macular degeneration affects the macula of the eye. And so the macula is on the back part of the eye. It's part of the retina. And what it does is it focuses the images that come into central vision. So that's why when you have age-related macular degeneration and over time as the disease progresses, you are less able to focus that image because that central part of the eye is deteriorating. And so visions become blur, and there's eventually some bleeding that happens, and that is what causes some of the vision loss. In this next image, we see dark or hazy spots. Now, this is something that will happen if you have diabetic retinopathy. This eye condition develops for someone with whether they have type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And the onset typically occurs 10 to 15 years after you've been diagnosed with diabetes. This disease, diabetic retinopathy, is currently the leading cause of legal blindness among working age adults. And right now, it's the leading cause of legal blindness for folks ages 20 to about 60. So it's having a really huge impact on working age adults. And so a lot of our, I would say younger folks coming to Society for the Blind are experiencing diabetic retinopathy and the effects of that. With this disease, what happens with diabetes, its effect on our bodies, is that abnormal blood vessels develop in the eye, and they leak and sometimes bleed. And when they do, this affects the center of the eye, and so it causes blurred vision and sometimes these blind spots. The body will reabsorb some of that, and so sometimes these blind spots fade away. At times, the bleeding occurs in the macula and causes it to swell, so that will blur vision. Again, sometimes over a couple of days or a week, the blurriness will go away and the eyes will be fine. So it's one of those things that kind of comes and goes, but it's important that individuals get treated promptly and that it's monitored so that, because if it's not treated, it will lead to permanent vision loss. There is no cure, by the way, for any of these 4 leading causes of blindness that I'm talking about this morning, but there are treatments that can help slow it down or control it over time. So in addition to people with diabetic retinopathy, folks with glaucoma also at times experience the multiple field loss. Folks who experience retinal detachment, and then if you have eye trauma, could be from a car accident, getting a soccer ball in the eye, can result with some multiple field loss. Some of it can be permanent, and other times it will heal over time. In this image, what we see is distortion, and so it gets a little bit wavy. This is what somebody who has glaucoma may experience. So they could have the multiple field loss with blind spots. They might have distortion, and on occasion they have both. Now, glaucoma is a rise in the normal fluid pressure in the eye. And how our eyes work, like every other organ, is that we have to expel waste from our eyes. And there's a little canal that runs around our pupil. And if that gets clogged and the waste can't flow out of it normally, kind of like a drain pipe, it backs up, and that backup causes the pressure to build in your eye. With glaucoma, we can't feel it. So a lot of times we think, well, if the pressure builds up, wouldn't we feel pressure in our eyes? You won't. And so this is why I strongly encourage you to get an eye exam every year, and encourage everybody you know to get one. The only way we can detect glaucoma is through the pressure test, or when they dilate your eye and they touch your eye, they're able to tell if the pressure is normal in your eye. So if it's elevated, they know to watch it. Glaucoma is very treatable and controllable through eye drops. If it advances, there is surgery they can do on the canal itself. But again, glaucoma is one of those, while it can't be cured, is able to be controlled for many, many years without any impact on vision. However, if it's not detected and it's not treated, it will cause permanent vision loss. And glaucoma has a much higher prevalence in both African American and Hispanic communities. So we really try to get the word out about eye exams for those communities. Currently, about 2.2 million Americans have glaucoma, and only half know it. So it just tells you that we've got to do a better job probably of advocating for regular eye exams. The next one, the fourth of our leading causes of blindness, are cataracts. And cataracts are caused by the clouding of the lens of our eye. In the vast majority of cases, cataracts really affect people much later in life, people 70s, 80s, and older. All of our lenses over time start to cloud just as part of the aging process. There are congenital cataracts, meaning that infants can be born with cataracts. And there are also cataracts that sometimes are formed after receiving radiation for cancer therapy. So there are other forms, but the most common type really are more age-related cataracts. In this case, what can happen, and people as young as 40 can start having their vision impacted by cataracts. Glare. So people driving at night, in particular with headlights, they cause a lot of glare and some distortion. You can see in this image also it's very hazy. And what happens is, because the lens is foggy, the amount of light getting through back to the retina is dimmer. And so without that clear light getting in, the image that's being projected also isn't able to get as clear. And so that affects the eye. For folks with advanced cataracts, there is surgery, and they remove your lens and they put in an artificial lens in the eye. Partly because of the aging of our population, by 2020, so just a few years from now, they expect over 30 million people 40 and over will have cataracts. So that's a huge number in our population, something to bear in mind. Oops, went ahead too many. There we go. In this image, you see what we call tunnel vision, and this is an image as seen by somebody with pretty severe peripheral vision loss. Retinitis pigmentosa is probably the most common degenerative eye condition in which you slowly lose your peripheral vision, and eventually it'll all go dark. And so it's just, and for some it's many, many years. For others it goes rather quickly. And so again, you can imagine how small a room would look. So if somebody comes in here, if you were to hold your hand up in front and just kind of look like through a straw, you get a sense of how that's what they see when they walk into a room. And so it's really important to give a lot of good direction, which we'll talk about in a little while. Retinitis pigmentosa is a hereditary eye condition. A similar, it's on a similar strain is Stargard's, which has a similar effect. You lose peripheral vision. That's something that we more commonly see diagnosed in children, generally in middle school. And both have a hereditary link to that. People with glaucoma also lose peripheral vision if it starts to progress before it's treated. And so that's often an indicator. If somebody comes in and they start saying that they can't see something on the side, that's often a first symptom that perhaps they're suffering from glaucoma. So before I go on to the next step, are there any questions about any of these eye conditions? Yes, sir. Hold for the microphone.
Okay, no, I'm just curious, how is it that glaucoma affects primarily African Americans and Hispanics, while
age-related macular degeneration
affects primarily Caucasians?
With macular degeneration, it has a lot to do with having blue eyes and something about the pigmentation of the eyes and light. That's why it's important to wear sunglasses. And that is what affects. So they've done research to show that generally people with more fair-skinned, blue eyes have a much higher rate of macular degeneration. I believe with glaucoma and also cataracts, but more so for glaucoma, there's a higher incidence of high blood pressure and possibly smoking and diabetes in both African American and Hispanic communities. And so both of those contribute to incidence of glaucoma. So I think what we see in many of these is that, you know, the bigger health picture of diet and, you know, access to proper nutrition can also probably help us lower some of these incidences of some of these, you know, what might be called secondary, but are pretty major conditions when you start losing your vision.
That's good. Good explanation. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So as you can see and probably imagine, you know, being diagnosed with a degenerative eye condition or traumatically losing your vision through an accident, through an assault, can be a pretty dire situation. And so that's where Society for the Blind comes in. We see individuals who, again, maybe have just received that diagnosis or who were born with a condition, and so they've grown up with decreasing vision, and so they've reached a point where they really need to learn what we call blindness skills in order to navigate the world, to work, and to live independently. Half of my employees at Society for the Blind are blind. And what value I believe this really brings is that these are individuals who themselves have learned and used the various adaptive tools and devices and skills that we're teaching. And they offer somebody in the classroom, around the building, who is a mentor and who understands exactly what these individuals are going through and what they're facing, and also stand as great models to say, they have these, you know, they have full professional lives, they're living very active lives. And so I think they demonstrate a lot that's very valuable, and not just to folks who are blind and low vision, but I think to the general community and to the business community. And so that's one of the things that we really try to convey is that, you know, pretty much anything is doable, whether or not your eyes work. And so it's really about living with vision loss and blindness. So our curriculum, and if you haven't been over, we're actually walking distance from here. We're at 13th and S, and I welcome any of you to come by and come for a tour or observe some classes. We have basically 4 core topics that we cover in our curriculum. Adaptive technology would be all of the devices, software, hardware that an individual might want to use in order to work, to live, to manage their finances, you name it. We have some of those here. This device is called, it's a handheld Pebble, and it's basically, I'll see if I can hold this up. It's a reader. I think you can see it. And what it does is it magnifies what you're looking at. It also can change colors and have different backgrounds. So for some individuals, based on their vision loss, they might need a blue background, yellow font, or vice versa. This is nice and portable. So this is something that you can take to a restaurant. You know, you can take on an airplane. It's easy to carry around. And I think this one sells for about $700. They run as, I think, as low as maybe $400 or $500 and up, depending on the level of sophistication that you want to get. Computers, software, all of that are things that we teach to our individuals. JAWS is software that you can load onto any device, and that will read all of the materials to the individual. So for somebody who is not able to read any longer, that would be the software that they would learn how to use. Zoom Text or Magic Eye is software also that you load, and this would enlarge the text, change the font, does a lot what this little handheld device does on a computer screen, on an iPhone, etc. And so again, what this does is it enables an individual to carry out and do the work that they need to do. So my program managers that are blind use JAWS to do their budgeting. So I'll walk in their offices, they know exactly what cell they're on. Their computer screen is black, so I don't know what cell they're on. But that's how they fill out and do all of their work. And so again, if you're working with somebody, if you ever need any of this software or you need to be trained on how to use it, we would be a resource for all of you as well as an individual with vision loss. Another core topic is orientation and mobility, and that's cane travel. So the straight white cane becomes very important. I think that you see two individuals there in a class. One of the things that's important to know is in order to qualify for a guide dog, an individual has to be proficient with the use of the white cane and be able to navigate their surroundings, because at times the guide dog can't travel with you, maybe the guide dog's ill, you have to be able to get yourself around independently. So that is a very important, and one of the first courses we try to get people enrolled in. They learn how to use public transportation as part of orientation and mobility. So it's not just walking with the white cane, but it's also learning how to use paratransit, BART, whatever they might want to use. Independent living skills, as you can imagine, is everything you need to know how to run your household without the use of your eyesight. So we'll teach them how to do laundry, how to go shopping and label their food, how to cook, get recipes online, print them in Braille. So all these different things, how to organize a kitchen, as well as how to put basic finances together. So again, we want people to be able to live independently on their own. And that is something that is very important, and often one of the more emotionally difficult things for someone when they've lost their vision is the sense that now I'm going to be dependent on somebody, and they've been super independent. It's very difficult. What I'm holding up are bump dots, and they'll all be available for you to look at when we're done. These simple little bump dots we use to put on microwaves, on the washers and dryers, and what they can indicate is the on button or the off button. We might put one in the middle of the number pad or on the 1, the 3, and the 5. And so it orients the individual to know where they are on a keypad. For the washers and dryers, if we know that they always want it on cold and they like the normal cycle, we'll put bump dots. So if the dials get turned, they always know to go back to that. And likewise with the on and off switches as well. So bump dots are very helpful. We also have braillers, and so they can also braille on and off onto their equipment. But again, somebody say with diabetic retinopathy, their feeling in their fingers might be compromised, and so Braille might not be the best way for them to identify materials and things like that, so we would recommend the bump dots. Finally, we teach Braille, and for adults we teach Braille is either grade 1 or grade 2. And for most adults, we teach grade 1, unless they've maybe already been using Braille for a while, and we'll teach them the more advanced grade 2 Braille. Where we're really emphasizing Braille is for children and younger folks. There has been a marked decline in Braille literacy among children with vision loss. In the 70s and 80s, it was upwards of probably about 80% of kids were learning Braille. Today, it's 10%. And what that means is that children who are blind and low vision are illiterate. Braille is literacy. It teaches them the alphabet, it teaches them phonetics, it teaches them the context of a sentence. And without that, they're losing all of those important literacy skills that help them be social people. And so that's why we were really pushing for Braille to be taught to the kids. There are a lot of books available electronically, but listening to a book being read is not the same as being able to read. And so that's why we really want our kids to learn Braille. Our senior program, and just going back, our blindness skills program, or our teaching program, mainly focuses on working adults, so 17 to 55, although we're seeing more and more people over 55 coming into our regular Monday through Friday courses. But we also have a senior program, and that is geared for folks 55 and over. And I can tell you we've had a number of folks over 100 in that program. And we use the same 4 core topics, but what we do is we modify them more for a senior lifestyle. The way we deliver the program is predominantly we do an 8-day on-site retreat at Society for the Blind for the seniors. So they come every day, and we go through different chunks of the curriculum every day. Their graduation exercise is that they go to Arden Fair Mall, and they have to navigate the mall and find certain stores. And so it's kind of like a treasure hunt. For those that can't travel to Society for the Blind, they may have mobility or other medical conditions, we do a lot of in-home training for our seniors. And because we also are scattered around in the 26 counties, folks in more rural areas, we do a lot more of the in-home training for those. Our low vision clinic is the only full service and full-time comprehensive clinic also north of the Bay Area. We have 4 optometrists, all of whom have specialized training in low vision eye care. So the typical eye exam in our office will take anywhere from 1 to 1.5 hours. Partly it's because we do a lot more intensive testing. There are different contrast tests that we do, and the eye doctor is also going to work with that patient on possible assistive devices that may help them enhance the vision that they have remaining. We also have a vision rehab therapist on our staff, and she works with patients on how to use their remaining vision in a safe and effective way. So somebody, say, who has a blind spot that's occluding the left part of their eyes, she's going to teach them how to look at objects so that when they're trying to see something over here, they may turn their head a certain way or adjust their head so that the part of their eye that still has clear vision is looking at that object. And so we work with them over several months to get that. And then finally, we have programs for youth, and we offer these programs in conjunction with Junior Blind of America, which is based out of LA. And so this is focused on kids from 8 years old and up. We do weekend programming, and it's really, again, focused on getting them engaged in social recreational activities. We do, for the teens, we talk a lot about, dress for success, how to show up for an interview, how to conduct yourself in an interview, how to get ready for college, how to write an essay. So we were working with them on really getting them ready to transition for adulthood and college and working on that. And we do a week-long summer camp, we call it Street Week, that's all focused on transition age kids, so 15 to 22. And they stay at Sac State in the dorms. They get $250 that they have to budget and manage for the week, including buying their light rail pass. And they learn, and they have to navigate. So they do the mapping for all of their daily activities. They spend a day at Society for the Blind in our independent living skills class. So we really give them a week of independent learning. And they keep a journal throughout that week. And I can tell you that it is quite amazing to hear what some of them have shared and how they change in that week, and how their world opens up for them. We had one boy a year ago. He was 15, and he had never spent a night away from home. And it was the first time. And so here he was, and he did a great job. He came down, spent the week, and all of a sudden he realized he could do things on his own. And so, you know, when you really see that awakening in people, it's pretty darn rewarding. So let's talk a little bit about what other things occur for folks who have vision loss. Sleep disturbances are very common, especially for folks who have little to no light input. A very small portion of the blind community, probably about 5%, have no light perception at all, so everything is completely dark. They can suffer from what happens is their circadian rhythms get off because they don't have any sense that's telling their body it's light and it's dark. And they can go for days where they're not sleeping, and then when they're supposed to be at work working, they're, you know, dead on their feet. It's a very real condition. For some folks, they actually literally fall asleep standing up when it gets very severe. There are some medications that are just starting to come out on the market to kind of help regulate that, but it is a very real situation. So if you're working with somebody and maybe they seem like they're nodding off or they're not there, it's really good to ask them if they're sleeping okay or if their sleep's been disturbed, if you, you know, to see if that's going on. Migraine headaches are another side effect of vision loss and vision problems. So that's another thing to bear in mind. If you've ever suffered from migraines, they can be pretty debilitating. For some folks, again, if it's been, say, a car accident that took their eyesight or something else, there can be mobility issues. And especially for older adults, they may need a walker. So here they've got a walker, they're trying to use a cane. What that can mean is that it's going to take longer to get from point A to point B, so plan ahead. For family members, that's one of the biggest adjustments, is how everything has to slow down in order to get from one place to another, just because it takes longer to navigate at times. So it's also okay to ask an individual about the amount of vision that they do have, because it may help you know, oh, we have to get something with JAWS or Zoom text, but also as far as the kind of materials you might give them, or using a magnifier and that sort of thing. Another is, as you can imagine, when you lose your vision, your sense of vulnerability is heightened. And part of that is we get so much information visually. And when that goes away, it can be very difficult to kind of know how safe is this area that I'm in. Think of the tunnel vision. You have such a little bit of visual information coming in. You're not going to know if there's, you know, some pack of hooligans coming at you and, you know, 15 years old and they all want to cause a ruckus, you know, or a car. So that can become a real issue, as well as balance. I went under learning shades to do a training exercise, and I can tell you that you go under learning shades and suddenly the room feels like 3 times its size. And what becomes really important is sound. You want to listen for, where are the doors? Where is there an opening? If you're on a second floor, you might want to hear if there's an open stairwell. And so noise can become very distracting to a blind person's ability to keep their bearings. So that's something to keep in mind if you're working with a victim of crime who has vision loss, to have a quieter room. If there's a lot of noise, they're trying to keep their balance. They're trying to figure out where they are. And if you're trying to give them some kind of instruction, it makes it really difficult. So it's not that they're not paying attention to you. They're trying really hard to keep things and keep themselves in balance and keep their bearings. Routes and routines are very important. So it's really helpful to have a repeated path to get from maybe here to where their home is. And so they're going to use those paths repeatedly. that can also be a detriment if somebody happens to be stalking an individual. So what we always try to teach our folks is, as they get more comfortable with their orientation mobility skills, is to always have multiple routes that they go to work, or if they like to walk in their neighborhood, so that they're aware of other ways to get out of there if they're feeling like something up ahead doesn't feel safe. So that's always a good thing. And it's also challenging, if you need help, to know if somebody's your friend or your foe. There was a woman who was being stalked on a train, like a BART train. And when she was assaulted by the individual, and when she needed to cry out for help, she was afraid to do it because she didn't know if the same guy was going to be the one pretending to come to her aid. So that becomes a real challenge for somebody who's blind or low vision. Is the person helping me really somebody who's helping me or not? So if you're, maybe identify where you're from. We always tell law enforcement firefighters, please say you're a paramedic or you're, firefighter, etc., so they know who you are. And obviously somebody could also falsely say that, but hopefully not. When you happen upon somebody who's blind or low vision, very important to know that in most cases, their intelligence is intact. There are certainly occasions where somebody might have an intellectual disability, but for the most part, somebody who's blind or low vision is just as smart, maybe smarter than you and I. But it's amazing how often people will speak to them as if they have a much lower IQ. And also for a blind person, their hearing is fine. And so we also see that sometimes, that people are speaking very loudly and there's really no need to. So I think it's just some instinct in us. But it's also important, as I mentioned earlier, you can inquire about the amount of vision. And also, I often, when people come into my office, I'll say, do you want me to close the blinds? For some of those eye conditions that cause glare, can also be very painful. If the pupil isn't getting the right visual cues, it's not going to get smaller like ours will in a brighter room. So that's why, again, you'll see individuals wearing sunglasses, and or lights will be off or dimmed. So even in this room, folks might want to ask that the lights be even lower than they are, just because of glare and the pain that can cause. And verbally describing your actions. When you're working with somebody who's blind or low vision, go ahead to the next slide. We use something called the clock method. And so if I were giving directions to Mika, I would say, okay, you're facing 12 o'clock. So whatever direction the individual you're assisting is facing, that's 12 o'clock. And so if I need her to go to her left, I could either say, turn to your 9 o'clock. You might say turn to your left, depending on. But if I'm using the clock method, I will use the numbers on the clock in order to give them direction. And that's a common way that we train folks in orientation and mobility, is a clock method. Saying it's over there isn't going to be real helpful. You can, there's something called shorelining that people use with a cane, and that is that they would walk along the edge of the wall and keep their cane next to the wall. If somebody is shorelining, and it's 3 doors down, you might say, count 3 doors, and that's the office that you want. Probably most of your offices here are brailled, so people would know the room number or the name of the individual. But again, clock method is good. If you're working with somebody, and we say this again, if you're a medical professional and you say you need to take somebody's blood pressure, let them know, this is Shari, I'm going to take your left arm and I'm going to put a blood pressure cuff on it, and then do it. Somebody who's been a victim of an assault, being grabbed, if you're blind, could be re-traumatizing again. So very important that we say what we're going to do before we do it. And also to make sure that we announce who's in the room, so that, and for each of us to do it so they learn our voices. It becomes very helpful. And it's also important that we remember that even though they can't see us, they hear us. And so to speak to them just like they are truly in the room. I've noticed that a lot is folks start referring to the individuals in the third person, and they're sitting right there. So again, very important to make note of that. If an individual has a cane or a dog, really important to inquire. I mean, generally they're going to have the cane or the dog right with them. On a rare occasion, they might get separated. And so do ask if the individual uses a cane or a service dog. There was a story recently, a guide dog actually leapt in front of his person to avoid her getting hit by a bus. They did both get hit. The dog took the brunt of it. Both survived. I think he should get Guide Dog of the Year. In the state of New York, guide dogs are not allowed to travel in ambulances. And so they took the guide dog, I believe, in a police car to the hospital. The dog was traumatized because it was pulling to go to its person. So just to give you a sense of how bonded they are. So really important that also you let the individual know, so-and-so's got your guide dog. It's going wherever that person is going, so that we really respect the relationship between those two. And the same thing with a cane, to make sure that their mobility cane stays with them as well, so that they have those devices. It's important if you're assisting somebody, or you might be out walking for lunch and somebody's at a crosswalk with a cane. You probably already know this, but just in case, I'll say it. Please never grab the arm or the cane. The cane is basically an extension of their body, and so we wouldn't want anybody grabbing us. We don't grab that. It's appropriate to, if you come up to somebody in the street, to say, may I be of assistance to you? And then they can say yes or no. They might say, yes, can I take your elbow to cross the street? Or if they say, can you help me cross the street? Offer your arm or your elbow to them rather than taking their arm. They will hold on, and they're trained. Okay, so people are trained as part of mobility to use an elbow, a shoulder, or the arm. If you happen to step up on a curb, your arm's going to move up slightly, and that tells them they're going to step up. Or it's certainly appropriate for you to say, we have a curb coming in about 2 steps. If somebody's at a corner and they don't acknowledge you when you ask them, chances are they're not being rude. They're trying to hear the traffic pattern. Because they're trying to hear, is the traffic parallel to me? Then I know it's safe to cross. So sometimes they're so focused on hearing the traffic that they don't even hear us talking to them. So again, it may not be that they're being rude. They might be, but chances not. But again, it's always okay to ask if you can be of assistance. Am I on my 5-minute mark yet? 9 minutes, okay. So let's talk about some of the devices. And I'll leave these up here if you want to check them out. These are handheld magnifiers, and each one has a varying degree of magnification. So this is a 12, and so it's smaller, but it has a pretty strong magnification. These are quite nice. They have different lighting. So one of the things that's important for some folks with low vision is they may need a very bright white light. Other people may need what we call a warmer light, so it's a little bit dimmer and more yellow. So these actually offer various types of lighting for them. So you can come in and see all the different magnifiers. So again, portable. We have a board member who uses one of these so that she can read all of her documents at the board meetings. So they become very handy. This is a device, and it's a little tool. This is a signature card. Pretty much all of my staff carry these in their wallets, and so that anytime they need to sign a document, it's just put on the signature line by somebody who does have vision, and they can sign their own name. So this is something that any of you would want, let me know. We'll get you a supply of signature cards. Again, it may seem small, but this means that somebody can sign for themselves and they know where they're signing. So it becomes very important for them. And so if you have documents that you need signed in order for victims to receive their compensation, this might be something that you want to have on hand. So there's some of the myriad things that we have. We have talking watches, talking clocks, various versions of this. We have a Braille sense. What I want to point to on this screen in the picture in the far right, looks like a scanner, which it is a scanner, except that it hooks up to the computer and it will convert the document using software to a readable form. So if you scan something and you print it off and you send it out, it's not going to be legible through JAWS because it sees it as a picture and it can't read it. So the individual will put it on that scanner, it goes in, and the software program converts it into readable text, and then JAWS can read it. So very simple device, but really handy. Braille documents are very handy. I saw that a lot of your brochures are online, so I'm assuming you've had them checked to make sure they're all readable for somebody with vision impairments. The Braille Sense is the device in this picture here. This connects to a computer, iPhone, notepad, whatever you have. On the bottom are the Braille cells, and so whether they're reading an email or a document, it reads the whole document to them. They hit a return button and they get the next line down. This one has quite a few cells on it because the individual using it is one of our Braille instructors. So the very basic one, I believe, has 12 Braille cells, and the more advanced have up to 80 because it can read that quickly. It also includes the keypad, so they can type everything in Braille, and it would come back to you or I in text form. Those run about $3,700. And this is a CCTV, so it's the blown up version of this. And they are also getting more and more sophisticated. They now come with JAWS built in so that, again, maybe somebody can read some things but not others. They're now able to have the ability to have the documents read. They come with cameras so that students can use these in the classroom, film whatever is on the whiteboard, and be able to have that for their note taking and whatnot. So there are different brands, different styles based on each person's preference. So these run anywhere from probably the lowest would be around $2,500 all the way up to about $4,500 for the CCTVs. And they come in a case, so they are also portable, but a little bit more clumsy than the nice handheld. We talked about Zoom Text and Magic Eyes, so that's software. The other thing are apps that are available on your smartphones, and particularly Apple products. Many of my staff would say that the best thing since Braille was the iPhone, simply because those products always came out as accessible. There are money reader apps, color reader apps, labeling apps, GPS maps apps. So it's really enhanced the ability for individuals who are blind or low vision to be independent. And with the many technological advances being made, including the Google car, people who are blind and low vision are pretty excited about their future because of the technology and how it's increasing their capacity to, go into jobs that they never thought would be accessible to them, to living independently and traveling at a breadth and a scope that they never also thought possible. So, it's a pretty amazing thing, and folks are seeing that life can be pretty happy living with blindness. So with that, I'll close and take questions.
Oh, okay. Hi. I have two questions, and I'll just let you answer them in the order you want to. So my first question was, you were talking about the decline in Braille education for children. Can you explain any conclusions or theories as to why that's happening? And then my second question is, what would be the best practice to get a person's attention? Say you're standing on the street corner like you mentioned, and you don't want to startle them by touching them, but you said that they're focused on hearing the traffic patterns. So what would be the best attempt to get their attention that you're trying to offer assistance?
Okay, so I'll take the Braille question. The predominant reason why they think there's been such a decline in teaching Braille is because of electronic books, and the sense that, books are available electronically so kids can listen to books, hear it, have it read to them. And so that's been the predominant reason why they think that there's been such a decline in Braille. But what they're finding is that the other, basically mental tools that literacy brings to us aren't being developed in these kids when they, go to preschool or kindergarten. So, having a book read to you doesn't mean you can read. You're not learning your alphabet. So that's why that's the predominant reason why they see it declining. And, the other would be there have been a lot of cutbacks in education in schools. And so there may be one Braille instructor for an entire school district. And the ability for that individual to spend the amount of time needed to learn Braille is woefully inadequate. And, and parents don't know Braille. So it's not like when kids come home and we can read to them and do the practice, the parents don't know Braille. And so it's hard to practice with your child at the same time. So I think it's a kind of a combination of that. The other would be, you can simply say, hi, can I be of assistance? And just announce yourself when you come up and just say, hi, how you doing? May I be of assistance? That sort of thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I had a question on your programs, and is there a cost for people, and what if they don't have funds to pay for these programs, and where do you get your funding from?
So good question. We are a nonprofit, so our budget is about $3 million a year. We fundraise about 2/3 of that. Where we get fees would be through Department of Rehabilitation, the Blind Field Services Unit. And so when an individual contacts us, we will ask them, are you a client of Department of Rehab? And if they're not, we'll want them to get in touch with Department of Rehab so they can get through that program, because they will pay for some of their schooling. I can tell you that it is, for some, they have waited over a year just to get an appointment. And, that's a year you're not getting any help. So part of it is I'm trying to ramp up our fundraising so we can scholarship people. But if we have more folks coming in who are paying out of pocket, so it can be, depending on the class they're taking, might be $55 an hour, might be $85, which isn't out there as far as it's kind of a music lesson or something else. So, but again, we're working on other ways to find philanthropically, how can we provide these classes. For folks coming through our low vision clinic, it's covered through healthcare. If they're seniors, Medicare, and we also accept Medi-Cal for vision exams.
All right, Shari, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and just take a 5-minute restroom stretch break. Please do come back. I see all of you for our next speaker, Carrie. Thank you. welcome back, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now for the second half of our trauma-informed workshop. So next to me is Carrie Michaels. Carrie has over 11 years of experience working with deaf and hard of hearing people who have experienced a trauma. In December of 2013, she joined DeafSAFE, and that's a domestic violence and sexual assault program for people who are hearing impaired or have hearing loss. Carrie has a mental health background with her master's in counseling psychology, and I actually met Carrie a couple of months ago at the SART meeting, the Sexual Assault Response Team meeting. She is a member of the SART program, which a lot of you guys saw most of that team present last month. So with that, I'm going to let Carrie take over, and you have a mic.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. Can everybody hear the interpreter okay? Can I get a thumbs up or some head nods? Okay, perfect. So I do have two interpreters working with me today, Stephanie and Rebecca, and they will be my beautiful voices that you will hear. And I also want to introduce my certified hearing dog. This is Kona. And she is my assistant. She is certified. She's a certified service dog. And her job is mainly in my home, where she's trained to hear and listen for specific sounds. For example, fire alarms, oven timers, somebody knocking on the door, or if somebody calls my name. And many people are trying to see her. So I'll go ahead and lift her up so you guys can see her. This is Kona. So anyway, for any specific sounds or noises that she is trained for, what will happen is she's excited about her work, and so she runs to the sound where it is, and then she comes to me and she takes her two little paws and she jumps on me and taps me. As soon as she gets eye contact with me, then she leads me to where that sound is. So that is her job. When we're out in the community, she isn't trained for all of the specific sounds in the community environment, but she is always listening, and you will see that she still acts as my ears in the community. For example, if there's a siren or an ambulance, or if a person is coming up behind me, then she will stop and look to where that sound is, so then I know to pay attention that there's somebody behind me or whatever the sound might be. Now, before I got Kona, when I'd be walking down the street, you know, I felt like I was constantly having to look over my shoulder so that I knew what was going around in my surroundings. And now that I have her, I'm able to depend on her for those things. And so it's really changed my life and impacted me in a really positive way. Oh, I work with deaf and hard of hearing survivors, and we use the terminology survivor and the reason instead of victim. And the reason for that is because the visual sign of victim is synonymous with the word stuck. And so it would break down to say stuck person. That's what the meaning of the sign is. And so in our community, visual cues is very important. So we utilize the word survivor. Oh, I am asking that the interpreter is also taking on the additional role of using the clicker for me. So she put it down and was signing. So bear with us as we kind of work through these logistics. A couple of statistics to start things out. There are 38 million deaf and hard of hearing people in the United States. And that incorporates a lot of different levels of hearing loss. Now, 93% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. And many, in fact, most hearing parents cannot communicate with their deaf children. They don't learn sign language, and so you will see that there is no communication in the home within that family unit. American Sign Language is the third most used language in the United States. Of course, the first is English, the second is Spanish, and the third is American Sign Language. Okay, next slide. Domestic violence and sexual violence is a lot higher incidence within the deaf and hard of hearing community. You see that it happens at a much higher percentage. And there's various reasons for that. As I was explaining, a lot of children don't have communication with their parents, and therefore, if they do have somebody who sexually assaults them or molests them, then how are they going to report, and who are they going to tell without having that access to communication? And so you see that there's a lot higher incidence because deaf and hard of hearing children are viewed as more vulnerable, because they can't hear what's going on in their environment, but it's also easier to take advantage of them because they know communication is limited. So this is just a couple of stats. Now we're going to talk a little bit about deaf culture. Now, a lot of people assume that deaf means that you are disabled. And the deaf community, we don't view ourselves as disabled. We are proud to be deaf, and we are proud of our deaf culture. Oh, it's important to try and see a deaf person as a cultural and linguistic minority, not as a disabled group. Well, that brings us to the next terminology that I want to talk with you a little bit about. Sorry about that, Kona. The word autism. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the other isms like racism or other isms, and it's a similar concept. When you talk about autism, it is the belief that one is superior based on their ability to hear. And so that can be a systemic attitude. It can be within agencies such as the police, law enforcement, courts. You even see it in domestic violence shelters, that there is an attitude of autism that is ingrained within the system, and sometimes even within the families. As I was explaining, the many deaf children within hearing families that don't have communication because they're the only deaf person in the hearing family. And that's actually my experience. I'm the only deaf person with my hearing family. Now, when I was growing up, I did have a little bit more hearing, so I was more associated with being hard of hearing. But I was the only deaf or hard of hearing person within my family. And there was a lot, I felt often oppressed because I had a lack of communication. I was the only one that couldn't communicate in the same way that the rest of my family did. Now, this is a recent quote that was said in 1999, so it wasn't that long ago. And this person said, "Language is human, and speech is language. Therefore, deaf people are not human, and deafness is a problem." And that is a clear example of autism and that attitude that has been passed down over generations, and the autism and oppression that deaf people have experienced throughout the years. Well, when we talk about the different models or perceptions of deafness, the first one is the most widely accepted, which is the medical model, which related to autism. And it basically looks that deafness needs to be fixed. And so the doctors will tell hearing parents, do not sign with your children, that you must get hearing aids or you must get a cochlear implant to try and make that child hearing. Do not sign with them. The medical model focuses more on speech and lip reading, which are skills. And the goal is to make that person become quote unquote normal. And normal means what? It means hearing. So as we've already talked about, is that deaf children are born to hearing parents, which means that the only 10% of deaf people receive their culture through their families. So now, did all of you learn your culture and heritage through your families? Or if you, yes? Okay, so you can imagine that you received your culture and heritage through your families, but a deaf person may not receive their culture and their identity until they enter their residential schools, and it's passed down through their peers. That's where they learn about deaf culture. It's where they learn sign language. And I'm an example of that. I didn't learn sign language until my third year of college. And that was the first time that I had met a deaf person, and I learned about closed captioning for television. And at that time, I learned about TTY, which is an old technology, but that was the first time I was exposed to how I could live my life independently. Before that, I was reliant on my family to make all of my phone calls for me, and I didn't understand what was being said on the television. I would just try to make sense of it based on what I was seeing. And I was 21 years old by the time I was exposed to anything that was within deaf culture. So you can imagine not having your culture and heritage passed down through your family. In the deaf community, it's often done through other ways. Now, I'm sure you've seen often in today's society that hearing parents are teaching their young kids, their young hearing babies, right, to use sign language. It's something often, we're seeing this happen quite often in our community. But however, the doctors tell you with deaf babies, do not teach them sign language. And so it's quite, it's ironic. It really should be the opposite. So going back to those perspectives, we've just discussed the medical model. Now, the cultural model or cultural perspective is more about identity. We use the words deaf or hard of hearing. We do not use the terminology hearing impaired because it's considered offensive. The word impaired has the connotation of still needing to be fixed. And so that terminology is not used. We identify ourselves as deaf or hard of hearing. And that identity is not related to the physical ability of that person's hearing, how much they can hear or not hear. A person may identify themselves as deaf, but still have some hearing. And again, I'm an example of that. With my hearing aids, I do have some ability to hear. However, I identify as a deaf person. I have absorbed and adopt the culture, and I would use sign language and a sign language interpreter. And so a person who identifies deaf is more about their culture and identity. And the same goes with hard of hearing. And so when you meet a deaf or hard of hearing person, just ask them how they identify themselves. And oftentimes what we do run into is that hearing people want to identify that person based on how much they have the ability to hear. And so it really comes down to their culture identity, which is there is a difference between deaf culture and hearing culture. So within the deaf culture and the cultural perspective, it's very rich. We have sign language and we have events and we have poetry, performances that are all done in sign language and something that's vital to the culture. And you'll see the sense of solidarity within the community because we have those shared experiences. Now, when we talk about American Sign Language, how many of you know sign language? Anybody in here know any? Okay, we got one over here. One person who knows some sign language. Fantastic. So you'll see often now that there's a lot more people who are taking American Sign Language classes. They're available at most of the community colleges and even in some high schools. Now, American Sign Language is a bona fide, legitimate language that has its own grammar, syntax, rules, and that's why it's accepted as a foreign language. And many students utilize that to satisfy their foreign language requirements when they take American Sign Language classes in high school or college. However, most people, or a lot of people, assume that American Sign Language is just English on the hands, and that's not the case. It's a completely separate and different language. There's a lot of differences between the two. And, obviously, American Sign Language is 3D. We utilize facial expressions. That's actually part of the rules within the language itself. We use our bodies and our hands, and so it's a visual spatial language. There is no written form of American Sign Language. And so a deaf person who uses American Sign Language as their primary language, they do have to learn English as a second language, to be able to read and write within our society. And you're going to see that within the deaf community that different people have the access to education varies within the community. As it relates to education and English fluency and proficiency. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of a deaf person who utilizes American Sign Language as their first language, and if they were writing or attempting to write in ASL, what it might look like. Anybody have any guesses what this might mean? Is this clear? Is it clear? Anybody? Okay, pretty quiet. Now I'm going to show you the English translation of or interpretation. Oh, it's quite different, as you can see, right? Now that is why writing back and forth with a deaf or hard of hearing person may not always be effective. And again, you're going to run into a variety of deaf and hard of hearing people, somebody who may be very skilled in both languages and be able to sign effectively and read and write clearly in English. And then you may see other deaf or hard of hearing people who will try to write ASL because English is their second language and it's not going to be as clear. And we oftentimes see within the system, especially with law enforcement and other agencies, that they want to utilize writing back and forth instead of an interpreter for things such as the report, and you can see what kind of problems that might cause.
This is another example here of a person writing or trying to write using ASL. Okay, let's go to the next slide and you'll see the English translation. Now it's clear, isn't it? So imagine this. Let's say there's a police officer and he's interviewing a domestic violence survivor. And let's say the police officer wanted to not get an interpreter, but just write back and forth and take the report. Can you imagine? Do you think that the district attorney would accept the ASL version, written version, as the incident that happened? Now I know with VCP, some programs rely heavily on the police reports. And you can see that that would be a challenge within the deaf community that they face when reporting. And so therefore deaf people will say, well, I don't want to report to the police anyway, because if I did, I'm not going to feel that they are going to take my report seriously. And so they have asked, deaf people ask repeatedly to get a sign language interpreter. And sometimes they're denied it. And so that is a challenge that a deaf survivor faces, is they, with the VCP program, for example. So those providers within the system, and also the shelters. So say they don't have access to communication. It's a challenge, and it's very hard to get those services that they need. And it's difficult for them to ask for help. Now let's talk about lip reading. How many of you feel that you're able to lip read? You can? Okay, we have one in the room. How many others? Okay, so let me ask you this. Now, hearing people assume that deaf people are able to lip read. Now let's look at the stats here. There's really only 25% of spoken language is visual on the lips, which means 75% is based on guessing and closure skills. So let's say if you guys are interviewing a person that has a hearing loss, and you want to, and they need the exact information, well, you cannot rely on lip reading. So you're going to therefore have a lot of misunderstandings. And you know that spoken language on the mouth, there are a lot of words that look the exact same. And so it causes for a lot of miscommunications. And it causes a lot of stress to the deaf person. It puts them under stress and it causes a lot of misunderstandings quite easily. Okay, so for domestic violence and sexual violence against women, the rates or the percentages are pretty similar to hearing survivors, though it's how the abuse actually happens is different. Now, I've seen both the abuser being a hearing and a deaf individual. You know, we see it on both sides. We had just talked about, you know, that it's hard to get the services that are needed as an interpreter. And so what happens is within this very small deaf community, and you know, and also maybe living in a small town. Let's say that there's a deaf person that lives here in California, and there are maybe deaf people back east. You know that they actually have connections throughout the United States. They know each other. Deaf people know each other everywhere they are, everyone. So that makes it difficult for a survivor to be able to escape domestic violence, be anonymous through the situation, because the abuser is able through networking to find out where the deaf person is using the deaf community, because they're so small and it's so easy to find out. So it's hard. It's a tough choice for the survivor to be able to get sheltered, to be protected. And because the community is so small, it's hard. So they disappear
they do disappear from the community. They're going to be losing their culture, their connections, families, everything. So it's not just about escaping the situation, but they lose a lot more than that.
These are different examples here that I have listed that talks about maybe different types of abuse that happens with deaf domestic violence survivors. Sometimes the abuser will, maybe tell the person in spoken English. They'll be using their voice and they'll say, "Oh, well, you're a deaf person and your voice sounds really stupid." And they will tell their hearing children that they're not allowed to use sign language with their mother. So the abuser would be saying that to the children and saying, "In our home, this is absolutely not allowed." And often with my experience that I have seen that with law enforcement, let's say there's a person that's the abuser and he can hear, he's hearing, and the survivor is deaf. The police officer does not provide a professional interpreter, and they rely on the abuser to speak on behalf of the survivor to represent what had happened. So the survivor, therefore, does not have a voice in the situation, doesn't get to authentically report what happened. And so then what happens is that adds to the oppression to the deaf person and the deaf survivor. Now, I'm not sure if many of you guys have seen that power and control cycle. Have you seen that? Or the control wheel? Now we have this here. We have a deaf agency that's established in the Bay Area. It's called Deaf Hope, and we work in partnership with them. There is a deaf survivor that has made this wheel that has illustrated it for us, and it tells you the cycle that people go through, and it's visual for the deaf people to be able to understand, because deaf people rely on, of course, visual language. So these drawings and words show you what they go through, and it illustrates what happens with the survivor. Any questions thus far? No, we're good? All right. As we can see that there are a lot of agencies out there that are not able or ready to provide appropriate services for deaf survivors, like providing a professional sign language interpreter, or if the person needs a shelter, when they're in the shelter, they need to have the video phone established so that they can communicate. A video phone is what deaf people use to utilize the phone system. It's a visual approach through like a web camera. So deaf people are maybe in a shelter, and again, they feel isolated even when they're in a protective environment because they don't have communication, they don't have phone for outside communication, and they don't have an interpreter. And, you know, I've seen some deaf women, they go ahead and they stay in the shelter, and they do that because if there's a hearing survivor that's there, how is it that they're able to communicate with the other women in the shelter as a deaf person? So when they're in the shelter, they're very isolated, and it's a very stressful already to begin with. So sometimes what they do is they'll leave and they'll go back to their abuser because they have communication. So oftentimes the abuser will then, let me think here. Well, they use power and control over the survivor. They tell the survivor, hey, if you leave me, there's no agencies or no one in the judicial system that's going to help you. And so then the survivor might leave, and they see that it's true, that they are not getting the services that they need. And so therefore, it empowers the abuser even further. Now, you know that the deaf community doesn't really know a lot about domestic violence, or they haven't been, taught about it because they've not received a lot of information about it. Now, I'm sure that maybe some of you guys are able to gather information from maybe listening to the radio or having it on the news, right? You hear about things happening in the community. Well, watching television, you pick up on a lot of information, and you hear what's happening throughout society. And you know that for deaf people, they don't often have closed captioning on every channel, so it's hard for them to get that information, which means they are even more isolated as a deaf person. And now providing interpreters. Now we have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. That is a law that was established in 1990. Now, under the Americans with Disabilities law, it says that deaf and hard of hearing people will have access to accommodations, which often means communication. Communication, meaning that a deaf person would get an interpreter. Now you have to realize that not all deaf people are fluent in sign language. You do have some hard of hearing individuals that don't rely on sign language, but they want to have like real-time captioning. Does anyone know what that means, real-time captioning? Yes, no, yes, no? Okay. All right. You guys are silent, but that's okay. Well, it's the same idea as, say you guys are in court. There's a court reporter, right? You guys are familiar with that? Now, if a hard of hearing person is sitting at a computer or a television screen, whatever type of monitor, they might have a person typing the words out so that the hard of hearing person can participate in the conversation through text. So some hard of hearing people prefer that accommodation. And you know that it is now illegal to discriminate against deaf people, which that means not providing them communication access. So it is quite important that we do keep in mind that there is a law, and it doesn't and I know that people think about money and being able to afford it, but we have to provide the law, and we have to give deaf and hard of hearing people full access to what they need. Now, certification for sign language interpreters. We have a national organization that monitors sign language interpreters, a registry of interpreters called Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. And you can get on their website and look up information. You can see which interpreters are available. You can check their names. You can actually verify if they are certified or not. And you can check their certification levels. And you can also find interpreting agencies that provide you can hire an interpreter through within your area. There are many agencies, though, that do have some complaints because of the cost of interpreters. And you know, there's a lot of education and training that's involved for an interpreter to get certified. So it's just, let me give you an equivalent. Let's say that if you guys go to court, and maybe you have a serious case, a serious court case, and do you want to have maybe a law student that's just learning, that's only taken 2 classes to represent you in your serious court matter? I don't think you do. I think that you want to make sure that you have a lawyer that knows what he's doing or she's doing, right? So imagine it's parallel to having a qualified sign language interpreter. A sign language interpreter that's only taken maybe 2 ASL classes won't be good enough, you know. So, you know, maybe agencies will try to get an interpreter that's not certified just to save some money, but it's not effective communication. You do want to make sure that you get a trained interpreter so that you do get the access to communication that's best for the deaf individual. Also, under having a certified interpreter, they have their professional code of conducts that they have to abide by. And there basically is a lot that's involved in professionalism within hiring a certified interpreter. Now, how to communicate with a deaf person. When you are talking to a deaf person and you have an interpreter there with you, make eye contact with the deaf person, not the interpreter. Also speak in the first person to the deaf person. Don't say, tell her that I said, or etc. You know, you get the point. Say, hey, I want from you, blah, blah, blah. The interpreter does the interpretation process, and they will interpret exactly what you say. So if you say to the interpreter, hey, tell that person that's sitting right in front of me, you don't say that. You don't need to, because the interpreter will do the interpretation process for you. Also, if you have a deaf person sitting in front of you and you're meeting with them, and be aware of your environment. Make sure that you're not in front of like a window or bright lights, because it's hard for the deaf person visually to see you with bright lights behind you or the glare of a window coming through. So it's really important for you to ask the deaf person, say, hey, where are you most comfortable sitting, so that we can see each other clearly. Never, ever, ever use children to interpret for you. You know that I have seen that sometimes, even with an interview with a police officer and a deaf person, they use children. Often, you know, deaf parents, they say, oh, well, I have hearing children here, and they're already there and they're available. And the police officer says, hey, I'm just going to use your children to interpret this situation for you. But you know what? That just further traumatizes the children. And the deaf person's not able to be open and honest, as they know that the children are speaking for them. And you don't want and sometimes they don't want the children to know the whole story. Now we have what's called CDIs, Certified Deaf Interpreters. Now, what I'm using here today, these interpreters are American Sign Language interpreters. These 2 gals here can hear. We call them hearing. Now, sometimes, on occasion, we do need to get a deaf interpreter. That means not that they're we say deaf because they use sign language, but they actually are deaf and they are certified to interpret. Now, we'll use them sometimes to help with the communication or interpretation with children, like maybe even when we're in court, or if it's a very, very serious issue that we need to have that certified deaf interpreter as a team. Now, the reason why we might pull in a deaf interpreter to assist in the interpretation process is to be able to better accommodate the maybe unique signing style of children or adults that maybe are not having as effective communication with a hearing interpreter like the gals that are here today. Yeah, I think the next slide has a picture here. Let me see. Yes, this will demonstrate it. You can see how it's like a four-way. It's a little bit longer of a process indeed, but it does help ensure for effective communication. Now, there is one situation that I do recall that happened with our agency. Now, we've had a survivor that was incarcerated, and
There was a person who was isolated in her home from the time that she was a young child by her parents, and she was kept in her home. And I don't remember the exact details of how she escaped, but she did escape, and she literally had no language skills whatsoever because she had been isolated in her home her entire life. And we did utilize a certified deaf interpreter in that situation to be able to even report to the police what she had endured. And so the CDI used a variety of different ways to communicate. They used drawings with everything, and drawings and pictures to make sure that that person understood what was going on and was able to express what had happened. So in that situation where you had not only limited but no language, the certified deaf interpreter was able to effectively match language and find a way to communicate. And so they were able to arrest the parents, and that's an example of a serious situation where there was unique language needs that a certified deaf interpreter was brought in. Oh, and so technology, as you know, we have a lot of that these days, cell phones and emails. And deaf people rely a lot on technology. TTYs are pretty outdated, and so you don't see those nearly as often today. There still are a few people who rely on that technology, but most deaf people do not utilize TTYs. What we do utilize these days to make phone calls is video relay service and a video phone. So you have a device that looks similar to this that sits on top of your television screen, and it connects through a high-speed internet to your television. And this is what the process would look like when you utilize VRS. So a deaf person would make a phone call. It connects to an interpreter through the video screen, and the process is very similar as what you're experiencing right now. It's in real time. The only difference is that the interpreter is on the screen instead of in person. Now, this is a free service aside from having to pay for the internet, but there is no fee for utilizing video relay service. And there are several different, there are also public video phones that can be utilized. If a deaf person walks into our agency, we have a public video phone that they can utilize at NorCal. And this is a huge improvement from the TTY, because the TTY relied on text and it was typing, and so it was a slow process and it didn't utilize the American Sign Language, where this uses real-time American Sign Language and effective communication is available. Okay, so we kind of already covered why we want to use VRS over TTY, because it can use American Sign Language. Now, these are a couple of different ideas of how agencies can make their services more accessible. And it's important to develop, when you develop your budget, that you put a line item in there for interpreting services before you need them. And that you have a contract established with a quality interpreting agency, and the contract is ready and in place, so that you are ready, that if a deaf person walks in, that you're able to utilize those contracts and provide those services, and that you know what to do, what the policies are, who can authorize getting the interpreter, who makes that contact, etc. Having those in place ahead of time. And if you have TVs in your agencies, whether they're at shelters or here, that you have closed captions already set up on the TVs. And that's, one of the things that we advocate within the shelter, so that the deaf person can at least have access to that. This is an actual situation of one survivor that I worked with. It was a deaf woman who had been abused by a hearing person. The abuser themselves was hearing, and the abuser was a certified interpreter. And so the deaf woman had gone into a domestic violence agency that was for the general public, not specific to deaf and hard of hearing. And they tried to fill out the restraining order by writing back and forth to get all the information. But unfortunately, she didn't understand everything that was going on by communicating through written form. So the TRO, the restraining order, wasn't done correctly, and when they did not provide an interpreter for that hearing, and so the judge did not even look at the survivor, not one time when she went into the hearing with the judge. They only looked at the abuser because he was hearing, never even once acknowledged the deaf person, and so the TRO was denied, and the hearing abuser, won that case. And so the situation, the deaf person came into our agency and was able to fill out the restraining order utilizing our services, and the restraining order was also the restraining order was approved, and the custody that the abuser had won because there was no interpreter provided during the hearing was reversed, and she did get her daughter back when she utilized our services.
Now, this is about a deaf survivor that was raped by a stranger. And so she went in for the forensic exam and to the hospital, and they did provide the survivor with a sign language interpreter. Then after, the detective would go to the survivor's house because he needed further information and wanted to interview the survivor. But the detective did not bring a sign language interpreter with him or her, and so therefore they were attempting to write back and forth. The deaf person is not fluent in written English, and so they asked several times that they wanted the accommodation of a sign language interpreter. After the third or fourth time, the detective would not provide that accommodation, and so the survivor dropped the case. This is another survivor that was severely abused by her boyfriend. Now, she was able to escape, and so she went to the office, and then she called 911, and 911 did show up and saw that she was severely injured, and she was transported to the hospital to get medical services, and they did provide a sign language interpreter in the hospital. Then after the fact, she wanted to speak to the police through the interview process and thoroughly explain what happened. And she asked for a sign language interpreter. And at first, the police officer said, no, we don't need a sign language interpreter. So then after going into our office and utilizing advocacy services, and we worked on that for like 10 days, finally, we were able to secure the services of a sign language interpreter for the interview with the police. Okay, things that you should not do. Okay, let's not ask a survivor just to read my lips, okay? And well, I know that a lot of people know how to fingerspell, you know the ABCs in sign language maybe, but now let's not rely on that to communicate, like anything a significant, important communication. Maybe if it's just brief, like saying hi or whatever, but for continuous dialogue, it puts a lot of strain on the deaf person's eyes. Now, as I just explained about the video phone, and that's through the Video Relay Service, VRS. You know, the Video Relay Service is just an accommodation through the FCC to make telephone calls. But now you cannot use the video relay to interpret in the room for you. Next slide. Now, if you have it set up in your agency where you guys do advertisements and you say, hey, we provide the accommodation of a sign language interpreter. We provide access for the handicap or the deaf community. Do you know word will get out? And then deaf people will tell other deaf people, and if you provide good services and you get a good reputation, that's going to be known in the deaf community, and they are going to frequent your establishment. And they will, and because they know that you're helping the deaf community and they know that you are an advocate, and so then they will tell each other and say, hey, you know, I want to go there. And but some people say, well, we've never had a deaf person provide or ask for services, or oh, I'm sorry, let me back up, because deaf people are, maybe are too afraid to be the first to ask for the accommodations because they're often, often the response is no. So they want to be able to go to a place that already has the established services. Now I encourage all of you to work with deaf advocates and maybe brainstorming, finding solutions. You can work as a team and how you can provide services or accommodations. And be sure to always ask the survivor, you know, what communication mode do you prefer? And don't make assumptions. Now, mistakes will be made, and that is okay. And deaf people really appreciate that you're even trying, you know, and that they're not being left out or being ignored, you know, and that will just show that you are really trying to work with the deaf community. And NorCal Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, we have an office here in Sacramento, and we service 24 counties, northeastern California. We have several outreach offices. We have one up in Redding, Yuba City, Stockton, and Modesto. Our headquarters is based out of Sacramento. And we provide various services from advocacy, and we have a communications department that provides interpreting services. We have peer counseling, etc. Many, many services for the deaf. And we have DeafSAFE, and that's the department that I work with. And we get our funding from the Office Against Violence Against Women. And we have federal grants as well that we utilize to provide services for deaf survivors and sexual violence, stalking, and dating violence. And we also provide free trainings, just like what I'm doing here today. And we provide consulting services, advocacy, peer support or mentoring, or even just emotional support going into court. We even help people fill out legal documents like restraining orders, anything really, any other assistance that a deaf person needs to navigate their way through the system and to be able to get in a safe place. And so we will help them, and we focus on, you know, deaf and hard of hearing individuals. And we have the National Domestic Violence Hotline for the deaf, and they have a video phone that can be utilized, and it's open during business hours. But that is one option that deaf people do have. The survivor can call that number for help. Now, this website has some wonderful resources, just a lot of information that you may utilize and how to provide access to services. And it talks about deaf culture as well that you can learn about. Okay, and if at any time you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Okay, and I want to thank you so much for your time here today. And do we have any questions before we end?
Actually, we had one question from YouTube. Nancy asks, does CalVCP provide any alternatives for deaf victims if they have not been able to report their crime to law enforcement?
Let me think. You know, I haven't personally have experienced that yet. I think that that's where that there is a challenge. That a challenge still lies there. Yeah, though I have seen though, sometimes if a deaf individual needs to go in or goes in for counseling, sometimes I've seen the VCP, they will pay for the interpreting services for counseling because the therapists, excuse me, it's very difficult to find a therapist that uses sign language. So VCP will fund the services of a sign language interpreter in the counseling session. Okay? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, and thanks everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.